please stand for the reading of God's word. Starting in James 2, verse 20. You foolish person, do you want evidence that faith without deeds is useless? Was not our ancestor Abraham considered righteous for what he did when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? You see that his faith and his actions were working together, and his faith was made complete by what he did. And the scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness, and he was called God's friend. You see that a person is justified by what he does and not by faith alone. In the same way, was not even Rahab the prostitute considered righteous for what she did when she gave lodging to the spies and sent them off in a different direction? As the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without deeds is dead. This is the word of the Lord. You may be seated.
There you go. Good morning to you all. Some of you are like, who's this guy? And I get that a lot. That's how I live my life. So let me just take a moment to introduce myself. My name is John Parker. I'm from church, Summit Church in Orlando, Florida. And God has privileged me with the opportunity to be friends with the leadership here at DCC and a fan from slightly far off of this church for many years now. I'm so grateful for the relationship that God has given me with DCC and the access to the amazing things that God is doing here. I think when we first became friends, there was, there's a bit of like, Ben and William, maybe wanted to learn some stuff from us because we are a little bit ahead in church planting, and so of course we were happy as a church to offer any wisdom we had. Now it's very much like I'm the old guy who's just appreciating the opportunity to learn from and experience what God is doing here. And so my family and I, by the way, this is my family. My wife Brandy is over here. I have a son who I won't point out to you, who's also in attendance today. And you notice there's a bit of a tonal difference in our family. One of the big adventures that God has invited us into in our life is in how he built our family. All our kids are from Ethiopia. What you see there is representative of 3 sibling groups. So each of the girls, who are the older ones in our family, have a younger brother who's their biological sibling. And it's, again, been one of the great adventures of my life. One of the other great adventures has been the church that God has called us into. We started, we're about 23 years old now as a church. I got to be part of the founding team for the church. We thought that, when you're 40, you might be old enough to know some stuff. When we're in our early 20s and believing that God was going to one day call us to plant a church, you can take the picture down, it's all right. Everyone's seen enough of me. We believe God would one day call us into planting a church. And again, I assumed, all right, we have to be old enough and know some stuff to do this. So I was happy in other ministry and going to wait till I was 40. And then God really gave us a sense that now's the time. And so we started on this adventure of planting a church. And so that's been one of the other big adventures in my life. I say that not so much that you know my story, but for those of you in here especially who are earlier on in your adult life and you're wondering if God can do big things through your life, he absolutely can. And it's worth saying yes to him in that. All that to say, it's been a privilege to be a friend to this church. I was very happy. Yesterday they gave me a new DCC shirt, and I told them the one that I've had, which was like one of the original ones, because I'm repping DCC in Orlando all the time. You can't even tell that it's a DCC shirt anymore. So I have new gear, and I'll continue being a fan and champion of y'all. Also, we've gotten to visit some over the years, not just being friends from afar, but our kids were all in the running sports, and we'd be up here a number of times every year for competitions, and so we're always visiting with the leadership team and attending when we are able. And so they invited me to be a part of this series on James, which I guess in one way makes sense in that a billion years ago when I was doing my senior thesis on in my biblical studies degree, my thesis was on this tension, what could feel like a tension, this dynamic of Paul's teaching on faith and works, reminding us that is by faith alone that we're saved, and James' teaching on faith and works, saying our faith, if it has no works, is dead. And so I was able to to do my thesis on that. I took basically 30 pages to say what Nate said last week so succinctly and so beautifully, reminding us that Paul's teaching is about our position with God. When he's saying it is by faith alone that we're saved, he's talking about our position and security and safety in the grace of God. Whereas James is getting into the nitty-gritty. He's talking about how we live that out. What impact ought our faith have on our actions and on the world around us? James says, "Show me your faith without deeds, and I will show you my faith by what I do." This week, we're going to continue in James's, really it's a smackdown about faith and action, right? Like he starts off, "You foolish person." We continue what he's essentially been talking about since chapter 1. Right? Like he kicks off being like, consider it pure joy when you face when you face persecution, when you face trials and tribulation. He's reminding us that if we're willing to be obedient to God in the face of suffering, God is at work. We can use our obedience even in the difficult seasons to build our faith. He's talking about how unimportant it is to only listen if you don't live out what you learn. To collect knowledge has no value if it doesn't impact how we live. The same for what we receive and what we give. If we're just gathering information, if we're just gathering the goodness of God and not giving it to the world, we're missing out. And in that verse we all love about true religion, right? Religion that God our Father finds pure and faultless is this, to stand with widows and orphans in their distress. Right? He's reminding us that showing off religiosity doesn't have value, but showing up in the lives of the vulnerable around us, that matters. All of this is about what it looks like for us to live out our faith. And then again, it's not about our status. It's not about the fancy people that we can gather around us, but it's about how we serve and how we put ourselves out there for the poor and vulnerable. The point James is making is simply this: what you do with your life matters. What you do with your life matters. What good is your faith if it doesn't impact how you live? If it's that way, your faith is a dead thing. It's useless and it stinks. That's where James left us off last week and begins this week, and I'll read it again. You foolish person, do you want evidence that faith without deeds is useless? Was not our father Abraham considered righteous for what he did when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? All right, now, if you don't know the story, or if you're like new to church and you're like, is that a real thing? Offered his son on the altar? It's weird. It's very weird. We're going to get into that in a little bit because that actually makes a lot of sense. But wasn't he considered righteous when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? You see that his faith and his actions were working together. And his faith was made complete by what he did. And the scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. And I love this. And he was called God's friend. You see that a person is considered righteous righteous by what they do, not by faith alone. And then James goes on to offer another example. In the same way, was not even Rahab the prostitute considered righteous for what she did when she gave lodging to the spies and sent them off in a different direction? And he goes back again to make this point. As the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without deeds is dead. That last, faith without deeds is dead, I want to be clear on something, or maybe mostly to undo some destructive teaching that I experienced in my early years in church. That phrase, so faith without deeds is dead, that should be sobering. It should get our attention. But for me, when I was young in my faith, that meant everything. Because I didn't read my faith without deeds is dead. I read my salvation without deeds is dead. And so again, it is important to remember, because that is not true. It is important to remember that what James is addressing here is our practice, how we live our lives. Think of it this way. The extension of grace and the offering of salvation, that's God's work. He has offered that to us. Our faith, where we place our trust, and how we live our deeds, that's up to us. James wasn't writing this to have the church question their position with God, but to question how they were living. Now, I want to jump in a little bit to these examples he gave of Abraham and Rahab. These would have been very familiar examples for the readers. James is writing primarily to Jewish Christians, and so this was their history, their story. And again, it is like the Abraham offering his son Isaac on the altar. That's weird, but it's not weird when you understand what was going on. You see, Abraham, God had made this covenant with Abraham. And he said, through your offspring, I'm gonna bring hope to all the nations. Good will come from the whole world through your offspring. And so God gave Abraham this unbelievable promise. And Abraham sometimes did a really good job trusting God in that. At one point, God was like, I want you to take your family and go to a place that I will show you, and there I'll establish you. I'll give you that land. And Abraham had enough faith in God to be obedient to follow him into the unknown. But Abraham also had some pretty significant failures in trusting God as well, and this promise that God had made. And a lot of it was around trying to make what God had promised happen on his own terms. God would bring him into an unfamiliar land, and Abraham would have his wife pretend she's his sister so that so that he could be safe, and so he was trying to control his own safety and security in that. And one of the biggest ones, again, remember, God had promised, through your offspring, I'm going to bring hope to the whole world. And Abraham and Sarah, they were getting well along in years. They did not have children yet, and so at some point, Sarah gives Abraham one of her servants that he could have a child through her, and thus try to fulfill the promise of God. And that wasn't what God wanted. And so when God says, finally, after Abraham and Sarah have a son, finally, like the tangible outcome of this covenant that God had made, God says, I want you to take your son and to sacrifice him on the altar. To take the fulfillment of the promise or the provision that I have given and to sacrifice it, to give it to me. Now, setting aside all of the personal, emotional turmoil of having to let go of a child that you've loved, like setting that aside, because that's bad enough. But to have your whole life built on a promise from God, and then for God to say, I want you to lay this down on the altar, that was no small thing. But I think God knew from Abraham's track record that Abraham had this inclination to try to trust in the provision of God more than in the provider. God forced his hand in that point. Am I enough? Can you trust me to fulfill what I have promised? Now, the story has a happy ending. Right when Abraham is up to the point of obedience to that, like the knife is in the air, God provides an alternative sacrifice. Abraham's son is rescued, Abraham is rescued, but Abraham knew that he was willing to obey God, even if it brought unbelievable uncertainty and unbelievable pain. And then in this beautiful contrasting example. So Abraham's like the hero of the Jewish faith, and then you have even Rahab the prostitute, a foreigner living in a fortified city, Jericho, and this is in the time after the Israels have been freed from slavery for hundreds of years, and they've been wandering through the desert, and God is beginning to bring them into the land promised. And all throughout the area, and in particular, it says in the city of Jericho, which, by the way, it's in Joshua chapter 2. You should read it this afternoon. It's a great story. But in this city, they'd heard about this God of the Israelites. They'd heard about the power of this God, and they were all afraid. Rahab had heard, and she was afraid. And these spies are sent out from Israel to go spy out the land. And it says, they're given instructions, pay special attention to Jericho. Jericho was a fortified city. It was an ominous place to try to invade and breach the walls. And so it's like any spy movie you've ever seen, right? Like the spies come in and they go to the underbelly of society, the places where it's easy to hide in the shadows. And they find themselves in the home of a woman of ill repute. And then word gets out that these two spies from Israel are in town. And the king hears about it. He says, go to Rahab's house and get these spies. Because all the way up to the king, they were afraid of the Israelites. They were afraid of the God of the Israelites. So the messenger comes to Rahab's house, and she's like, oh, these guys, I didn't know what they were up to, so I just sent them on their way. They probably are out the city already. Go look for them. And meanwhile, she's hidden the spies, and then when night comes, she helps them escape through the wall with the promise that their God would spare her when he brought about victory. Now, for Rahab, this was no small thing. This was no small thing. To trust a God you'd never encountered, who you only knew by rumors and hearsay. To believe that he could be more powerful than the king, than the gods of your people. It says, everyone in Jericho had heard of this God, and they were afraid. She had that same fear. But her belief that this God could be more powerful than anything else in her life led to action, which then brought about her rescue. For both Abraham and Rahab, their belief and their behavior were aligned. Sometimes I get a little hung up on that word righteous, right? Like for both of them, it was credited to them as righteousness. I think the easiest non-scholarly way to read that is God said, you got it right this time. You got it right this time. That was the one common thing between Abraham and Rahab. They had to risk everything to be obedient to God. For Rahab, like she had pieced together a life. I mean, she's in the city where the king lives. Like they like if she gets busted hiding spies, like it's all over for her. She had to risk everything. Her safety and her security, her life even, to trust in God. For Abraham, he had to risk everything that had been promised to him, all his hopes for the future, to be obedient to God. In these very different people, the common element was that God asked everything from them. James isn't bringing home his point with lightweight examples. He's not saying, go out there and do little things for little faith. He's giving us big examples of big obedience, of absolute surrender. And he's showing us that there is a direct connection between the level of our faith and the level of our obedience, the level of our surrender. In some ways, it's a bit, the chicken and an egg thing, right? Like, does big faith lead to big obedience, or does big obedience lead to big faith? And the point James is making is yes. Right? This whole time he's been telling us that the whole point is that our faith and our deeds, our works, our actions, our obedience are integral to each other. Too much so to be separated. In fact, there cannot be life for our faith without obedience, without surrender. It's like he's saying, you can't be a runner without actually running. Right? Like, you can have all the gear, you can have the fancy shoes and the sweat-wicking clothing and all the headphones and all of that stuff, but having those things doesn't make you a runner. The only way you can be a runner, is by running. James is saying, listen, dummies, like, you foolish person, if you want to be a follower of Jesus, you can't be a follower of Jesus without actually following Jesus. But the question I really want us to wrestle with today is this. James has been mentioning the death of faith a couple of times, at the beginning and the end of this passage. So the question I want us to wrestle with is, what kills our faith? You've probably experienced it at some point if you've been walking with Jesus for a time. And you felt your faith weakening, slipping away, wilting. What kills our faith? I think there's two main things. The first is misplaced faith, right? If we place all of our faith into something that is not worth it, then both our faith and our obedience lack the life that we are intended for. And misplaced faith leads to misplaced obedience. That's, I think, one of them. And James hints at them here. But I think the one that he gets at most, in answer to the question, what kills our faith, is this: starvation. If it is our obedience that gives life to our faith, then lack of obedience starves our faith, suffocates our faith. And oftentimes when we're in those seasons where we feel like our faith is fragile, if you're like me, you tend to look at God first. Be like, all right, God, my faith is weak, therefore you have done something wrong. But here's the thing, our God is always faithful. Our God is always good. And our God is all powerful. So maybe, if I feel like my faith is starving a bit, it might be that I have stopped feeding my faith. There's an author I was reading recently. Sam Alberry is his name, and those book isn't primarily autobiographical. He does bring in his story of surrendering to God, his attractions and his hope for relationships and all of that, and to just be obedient to God. He said there are people who come up to him and they're like, wow, like look at the surrender that has taken for you to obey, the sacrifice that you've had to make to be obedient. Like, that's so remarkable. And he's like, it shouldn't be remarkable. Like, Jesus doesn't ask for everything from some people. He asks for everything from everyone who would follow him. Not because he needs it, but because we need it. He doesn't ask for little faith, and he doesn't ask for little obedience. He asks for every bit of us. Our challenge today is simply this: to feed your faith. Feed your faith. Give it heaping helpings of obedience and surrender to a God who is always faithful, who is always good, and who is all powerful. I've been a follower of Jesus for a long time, since I was real young. And I grew up in a family that was both very Christian and very structured. And one of the first challenges in my faith was when the structure of my family suffered. And I had to come to terms with the fact that this stability, this thing that I knew as my family, while it was being rent apart, to see and recognize as a child in kid ways that my faith in God had become interwoven with my faith in my family. And insecurity in my family was for me meaning insecurity in my faith. And I had to recognize in that season that what I had been trusting in wasn't God alone, but it was what he had provided for me in my family. It was a bit of like the Rahab thing, right? Like my life was the way it was, and all of a sudden it wasn't. And was I going to choose to trust God? But then the other one, the one that really got me, was in college. I grew up in, poor is always relative, but I grew up in relatively, humble circumstances, and spent my last 2 years of university being like the poor kid at a rich kid school, and which was fine with me. Like it was not uncomfortable, but rich kid schools also came with rich kids tuition, and so I was working really hard to make ends meet. And so, and to pay my bills. At some point, I was working at a little grocery store in the town that our college was in, and one of my primary means of food was like eating the day old meat and bread from the grocery store. Right, that's kind of gross and scary, but like I was just getting by, right? But I had nothing. I'd worked the summer previous to my senior year really hard to pay as much of my tuition as I could, and so I'd been able to take care of the fall semester. I was coming up on the spring semester, the final semester of college. And then I'm going to be launched into marriage and ministry and all the things. And I've been saving away my tithes. Like I'd grown up in a family where tithing was just a normal practice, and so I've been tithing and working at this grocery store. I've been saving up my tithe, but we didn't have there wasn't like a church dynamic where we felt like we could give our tithe to that church. So I'd just been kind of holding on to it, and then using it a little bit for other things that seemed important. And so what I had started the fall semester with for my tithe had been whittled down a little bit. I think I had like $236 left. And that was all I had. Like it wasn't the sum total of my tithe. It was the sum total of my entire value as a human being from a financial standpoint. Like that was it. $230 and change. And my tuition bill was due for this final semester, and it was like $6,500. So what I had, like, no way was it going to pay the bill. But it was all I had. And all of that I'd committed to God. And man, was it a struggle to actually give that to God. I mean, I don't know what they do, like to the poor kid at a rich kid school to let them know that they can't go there anymore. But whatever it was, people showing up in tuxedos and throwing me in a muddy ditch and being like, "You have not paid your bill." I was fully expecting that was going to happen to me. And so I tried every which way I could think of for God to give me permission to give what I owed Him, and to use that and somehow to pay my bill. And man, I knew for whatever reason, I knew that like this wasn't just about that little bit of money and that school fee. It was about what faith and obedience would look like my entire adult life. I knew that I was setting the standard in this, and it was so difficult. And I knew how like wily I can try to be. I'm not actually wily, but I'm like negotiating with God. I'm like, "God, you have called me to ministry. That is why I came to this school. That is why I'm majoring in biblical studies. And so wouldn't giving your tithe to my tuition, like, isn't that just basically giving to ministry?" And God's like, "No, it is not. Not for you, son." And so then I'm like, well, in the Bible, they cast lots. And so no kidding, I'm flipping a coin, heads, heads, heads. Every time I'm like, "Okay, God, it's yours. I'm going to give it to you." So I gathered it all up. One last time, "Are you sure you want this?" yes, I want this. So I'm like, all right, it's yours. So I talked to Brandy. I'm like, I love you. I might get kicked out of school, and you need to help me pay my tithe because I don't have a bank account. And so we put together the money. We decide we're going to sponsor a child through Compassion International for a year. We're going to prepay a year of sponsorship, and then later that year when we get married, hopefully we'd be able to continue it on. So I put all this money together. I fill out the little form. I put it in the envelope. I did not even have money for a stamp. Because God's money was God's money. And I'm like, by this point, I'm so committed to giving this money, I'm not even going to pay for postage out of that money. So I'm like, all right, what do I do now? So I go through the whole house or the whole apartment again, looking for stuff. I find just enough money to pay for a stamp. And I walk this envelope to the post office, and I go and I drop it in the box. Now, what I didn't have was any assurance from God that he was going to cover me. It wasn't like he said, don't worry, I'm going to provide for you in this way. But what I also had was complete trust that if there's ever a doubt, it's worth giving everything to God. There's no way I could have paid that bill on my own, but I knew that God is always my provider and he is always faithful. So I went ahead and dropped it in and turned around feeling like I don't know what's next, but I had no doubt that I had done the right thing. If you want big, fat, juicy faith, then feed it big, fat, juicy obedience. Don't just surrender a lot, surrender everything. Put it all on the line. Remembering that God is always faithful. He is always good. He is all powerful. I don't know what that might look like for you this week. Where it might be that your faith is starving. What it might look like to feed it big, heaping helpings of obedience. But I can tell you, just from the goodness of God in my life, his faithfulness to his people throughout generations, that whatever we give to God, he can do more with than we could ever do on our own. It might be, if you've been tracking through this series, and for you, you're still stuck in like the first couple of verses. Right when James is like, consider it all joy, and you're like, no, I made a contract with God that when I gave him my life, he would make it better. And I want it to be better in these ways, and I'm uncomfortable and displeased with God for the way that I'm suffering. And big obedience for you in this season might be letting go of your expectations for comfort. Believing that God can bring goodness through that he can build you up. I think in our culture, in our time, in our context, the biggest challenge to our faith is what money can do. Right? Like we can buy all the things that we need. We can be real comfortable, real numbed out. And so maybe if you don't know what God is asking of you, maybe you risk and trust God with your financial provision. Maybe you give something significant to his work in the world. Something that makes your palms sweat a little bit. Like, what am I going to do if I don't have this? Because this has meant safety and security for me. Maybe it's in your vocation and your calling. You have been training and prepping and getting your education and planning on something, but you've forgotten to surrender that to God. And you need to hold that, you need to lay that on the altar and be willing to sacrifice it for whatever he might ask you to do, whatever he might invite you into. To hopefully hear him say, you got it right this time, my friend. Maybe what you're doing is you're doing all kinds of obedience over here, right? Because you know that you're not being obedient in this area of your life. And you're thinking, if I can double down in obedience here, the kind of obedience I like, maybe God won't ask me to be obedient here. Maybe God won't ask me to surrender here. And you can feel your faith starve. You can feel it dying in that area of your life. The inconsistency is killing you. It's killing your faith. And maybe you just need to give it all. Surrender every bit of your life, all you know of yourself, towards all you know of Jesus. As I've reflected back on that crisis of faith in my life, I've realized that it wasn't what God did following that built my faith. Because I was already all in when I dropped that envelope in the mailbox. I had fed my weak, scared faith just enough obedience for it to make all the difference. And it came to life. You look at so many of the miracles Jesus did, and the miracle comes after the faith and the response, the obedience, the belief, and the behavior. But God did do something good and surprising to me in that. I dropped that envelope in the mailbox. I was in our little campus post office, so I went and checked my mail, probably expecting another reminder of overdue tuition. And I had an envelope from the school, and I was like, oh man, this was a different kind of envelope. It wasn't like an overdue bill envelope. It was like an official kind of thing. And I was like, they found out already. They're going to tell me the college police are after me, whatever. And I opened it up, and inside was an award notification for a scholarship for $6,500. A scholarship I didn't know I was eligible for. And you know what the scholarship was? It had fancy words to it, but it was for being the poorest kid at my university, right? Like, it was like, you're so poor, we're going to do But you know what? The proximity of that gut-wrenching obedience and that act of provision, I think was God's way of saying, in that moment, at least this time you got it right. Your belief and your behavior lined up. And he knew I needed to know that. And gosh, that has served me well ever since. There have been times, when we started a church and it's like going to be all the good things, and then when you run into some of the most gut-wrenching things church can experience, it's been so much easier to surrender it to God, my expectations of how things ought to be, because I've seen God be faithful. And it's not just in difficult things, it's in wonderful, beautiful things as well. If we hadn't had the courage to be obedient to God in adopting the children that he has blessed us with, we'd have missed out on one of the best things in our life. Whatever we give God, however big our surrender, it's never bigger than what he's done for us. And it never goes beyond his faithfulness. It never goes beyond his goodness. So my encouragement to you this week, feed your faith in big, scariest, terrifying ways, and see what God does with that. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, you are a good God. You are good always, in all things. And you are a faithful God. Your faithfulness took you to the cross in obedience to your Father, Jesus. We will never come close to the level of faithfulness that you have shown us, but we are grateful for it. And we pray that you will give us the courage to feed our faith today, tomorrow, in the weeks ahead, knowing that whatever we surrender to you, you can do more good with than we could ever manage on our own. I pray this in your holy name.